now I would request the President to say a few words. Yeah.
I just wanted to personally have an opportunity just to wish you all the happiest of New Year. As you know, we have crossed the line into a new time. It's a time when many people make resolutions, when we make promises to ourselves about the people we want to be. Just wanted to share with you something that a great man from the past century, he was the second Secretary General of the United Nations. He made the statement once. It wasn't specifically about New Year's, but I think it does apply. What he said was this. His name was Dag Hammarskjöld, and he said, "For all that has been, thank you." So for us, for this year, for this past time that has been most challenging for many of us, if we can find it in our hearts to genuinely say thank you for the challenges that we have faced, and clearly the fact that we're sitting here, the challenges that we have met. Thank you. But he added to that, for all that has been, thank you. For all that is yet to come, yes. Yes. To all of the unknown beauties, sorrows, challenges that we will face in this coming year, the attitude of mind, and more importantly, the attitude of heart, is the openness that says yes. So for our New Year's opening, and for my wish to each and every one of us, may we have during this coming year the openness to not merely our work within the Theosophical Society, but our relationships within our families, with our friends, that is sufficiently open to accept the challenges that come, to say yes to the difficulties, the sadnesses, as well as to the many beauties that comprise every one of our lives. Fact of the matter is, come this time next year, this is a unique gathering. It will never again repeat. We will have future conventions, of course, but its composition, the atmosphere, the environment that we bring into being here will be different. And the people sitting in the seats will be different. The fact of the matter is that when we come back here next year, there will be some among us who will no longer be with us in body. So, to cherish and to say yes to this utterly unique moment that we share now with one another is the attitude that I would like to adopt for this new year. So with that, I turn you over to our eminent speakers. I know all of them, and I can say quite proudly that you've got quite a stage here. So it's a good way to start the new year. Thank you.
This is an auspicious day, being the first day of the year. And I wish, after the International President has also done, that may the new year 2023 be an auspicious year, and may it bring light, love, peace, health, and prosperity to us and to the whole world. This morning we have two excellent speakers, I would say, members of this Theosophical Society for many years. It is Brother Pradeep Gohil, you all know him, National President of the Indian Theosophical Society, and Sister Erika Georgiadis, who you know her very well, and she is director of the School of Wisdom. They both have interesting subjects to talk about. So, Brother Pradeep is going to talk about the common ground on which responsible world citizens stand. Brother Pradeep Gohil is president of the Indian section of the Theosophical Society since January 2017. He did his schooling in Bhavnagar, graduated from school in California as AFS scholar, studied chemical engineering from BITS Pilani, did MS in chemical engineering, MS in physics, in plastics, and MBA from the United States. Worked there for 8 years, returned to India and got a degree in law. He has been the governor of Rotary in Western India, represented India at the Parliament of Rotary in 2013, chairman of the Board of Governors of the Government Engineering College of Bhavnagar, taught several MBA subjects for 20 years. He was a consultant of UNICEF, was a member of the Senate and the Executive Committee of SNDT Mumbai University. He is a member of the Board of Governors of the UPL University of Sustainable Technology. Is president of the Bhavnagar Ladies Education Trust with 4,500 students from kindergarten to PhD. He did a PhD at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, in 2008. After postdoctoral studies in Germany and Singapore, he joined IIT Madras in 2011. He has taught a wide spectrum of courses that include classical physics and quantum physics. He is married to Hina. He has a daughter, Pavitra, settled in the United States, who also has a daughter, Kaira. I'm very happy to indeed invite Dr. Pradeep to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Alex. You were just so generous that you gave me certain degrees like the PhD, which I don't even possess, but that shows your affection for me, and I'm very, very grateful to you. Our president, Brother Tim Boyd, chairman of this session, Alexandros Bosolengas, Vice President Deepa Padhi, Erica Georgiadis, sisters and brothers. First of all, wish you all a very happy and prosperous New Year. What a pleasure it is to be back in this picturesque oasis of spirituality after a gap of 4 years due to COVID. Adyar is picturesque because you are surrounded by the rustling trees which form a sea of green. You have constantly chirping birds of all hue and shades around you. The brimming Adyar River in the north and the endlessly breaking waves of the Bay of Bengal in the east. And amidst all this, the lovely Adyar Theatre stands like a lighthouse of spirituality from where so many words of wisdom have emanated for decades through soul-searching speeches and memorable discourses. I'm so very privileged to be standing here addressing to all of you. This exciting place, Adyar, is also the home of the masters, and you feel the tingling of their presence and love for us just as you enter the gate of this campus. There cannot be a better place for us to relax and temper our thoughts in search of the real truth. In this setting, we have the 147th International Convention of the Theosophical Society with a lovely theme, our responsibility in the interconnected world. To understand and deliberate on that theme, I'm going to speak to you today on the common ground on which responsible world citizens stand. I'm sure one must have so often said, my house, my city, my state, my country. But when one always says, our world. So it should be clear that the world we live in is our world. It is not the Chinese earth, neither is it Japanese. It is not the German earth, nor the Indian. It is our earth on which we are all living together. That is a fact. But thoughts have divided it religiously, economically, culturally, racially, and geographically. A month-old child does not distinguish a Hindu from a Christian, a Jew from a Muslim, or a Buddhist from a Sikh. It neither knows that it is an individual, nor is it concerned with society or religion. It is outside the field of individuality and the structure of a religion or society. It is an entirely different human being. While maturing and learning as we become adults, wouldn't it be nice if we retain that quality of a child? Then we would all be standing on a common ground as world citizens. The world, which is divided into nations for ease of management and proper administration, is also the cradle of war and destruction, as we are seeing in Ukraine these days. So even though we know the reality that the world we live in is our world, and that it is not Russian world or Ukrainian world, thought has divided it geographically. There is no doubt that it is this division that is causing havoc in the world. Though we have divided the world for security and administrative reasons, it is various forms of patriotic and illusory ideas which are eventually bringing about war. We know from theosophy that all human consciousness is the same. Whatever part of the world we live in, we all go through a great deal of suffering and pain, great anxiety, uncertainty, and fear, with occasional or frequent pleasure. It is an irrefutable fact that is the common ground on which all human beings stand. You may dodge this reality and say, I'm an individual. But when you look at it objectively, non-personally, not as a British, French, and so on, but through honest examination, you will find that your consciousness is just like the consciousness of all human beings. You may be slim or fat, tall or dark. It is inwardly, psychologically, we are all having a terrible time. We all have a great sense of desperate loneliness. You may have a wife or husband or children and all the rest of it. But when you are alone, your consciousness has a feeling that you have no relationship with anything. You are totally isolated. This is the common ground on which all humanity stands. Whatever happens in the field of this consciousness, we are responsible for it. In other words, if I am violent, I'm adding violence to that consciousness. If I'm not violent, I'm adding to it. I'm bringing a totally new factor to that consciousness. So I'm profoundly responsible either to contribute to that violence, confusion, and terrible division, or as I recognize deeply in my heart, in my blood, and the depth of my human being, that I am the rest of the world, that I am mankind, that I am the world, and the world is not separate from me, then I become totally responsible. This is rational, objective, and sane. The other is insanity, to call oneself a Hindu, a Buddhist, a Christian, and all the rest of it. Those are just labels. So all of us are personally and severally responsible for what is happening in this interconnected world. When one has that feeling, that reality, the truth of it, that every human being living on this earth is responsible not only for themselves, but for everything that is happening. How will we be able to translate it in our daily life? The world as it is now is full of violence. Only very, very few people escape from it. Once I realize that I'm totally responsible, then I'll take care that competitiveness between nations would not destroy the world with less powerful trying to become more powerful. Realizing that I am the rest of mankind and I am totally responsible, then I shall cease to be competitive to avoid its negative effects. The religious, economic, and social world is based on hierarchical principles, but being totally responsible, I shall not have a hierarchical look. I shall also not seek status, because that will contribute to the confusion in the world. It is important at all times, and especially during these critical days in the world, to think very clearly and to know our feelings very intimately. We are not separate from the crisis. Whatever happens to an individual, a nation, or to a group of people is happening to each one of us. Since we are not so intimately connected, we ought to be fully aware and deliberately conscious of our thoughts and feelings. If we are modeled, if we take sides, if events persuade us and we are not aware of the causes of the events, we shall be merely carried away by them. Events are occurring with extraordinary rapidity these days, locally and worldwide, and their impact is so very strong and fierce, it requires us to be extraordinarily clear in our thoughts and fundamental in our feelings, because the stronger the event, the greater the mess, intensity, turmoil, and chaos within us. Events close by naturally upset and disturb many. And it is all right to have strong feelings, strong emotions, unwrapped and purposeful, because without any feeling, one is dead. Mere intellectual froth is of no significance in moments of great importance. The danger is to translate great events intellectually and superficially and thereby pass them along. Whereas if one is able to very closely and very cleverly follow the causes of psychological disturbance and maintain emotional attention, without the interference of the intellect, perhaps we shall be able to bring significance to the issues. We can safely say from all this that I have just indicated that whatever we have seen in the world and the cause of destruction in the world is the fact that our beliefs have become stronger than love. I feel that the responsibility does not lie in anyone for any crisis like the Taliban crisis in Afghanistan at present. It lies with you and me. For a citizen of Afghanistan to understand any crisis like the present one, which is localized to Afghanistan, their citizens should approach it diligently, with intensity, with clarity, and with the intention to go very full into it and see all its significance and depths. I wonder what would be the response of Shia Muslims for the murder of their head of the sect by the Sunni Muslims. Would they be concerned as a personal loss or as an indication of world events? Maybe the world trend. If it was a personal identified loss, then we have to look at it very carefully, intelligently, and purposefully. If it was an indication of the trend of event in the world crisis, that has to be closely followed too. So we can approach this problem in these two ways, either as a personal loss or as an indication of the whole catastrophe that is taking place in the world. If it is identification, a personal loss, then it has quite a different significance. There is in all of us the tendency to identify with something greater, whether it is a sect, a religion, a nation, a person, or a superior consciousness. It is so much worldly to be identified with a group, a sect, or a person representing the sect. When anything happens to that person or sect, there is a shattering feeling. The desire to identify oneself with a sect or country is because one becomes something with it. This identification is the very danger because it has led to the most extraordinary barbarities in history. If you identify yourself with a sect or country, with your communalistic spirit or an idea, then surely you are responsible for any calamity that happens. Organized sects and religions are based on isolation and separatism. You have the Shia Muslims, the Sunni Muslims, the Christians, the Hindus, the Buddhists, and many more. Surely you are responsible when you worship in one temple and prevent somebody else from going into your temple. The obvious fact that I am drawing to is that when you have a religion, it creates conflict between man and man. As I said earlier, when belief is stronger than affection and love, you are the very cause of destruction. I come back to Mr. Krishnamurthy's famous words where he said that we are the world and the world is us. The world is going to be what we are, and so it is so important that we practice that what we would like others to follow. There is a saying, practice before you preach. There is a story about Mahatma Gandhi. Once a young boy obsessed with eating sugar every day was becoming unhealthy because of excessive sugar. Exasperated with this habit of his, the mother decided to take him to his idol, Mahatma Gandhi, hoping he would put some sense in his mind. After traveling for hours, they reached his ashram. On meeting Gandhi, the woman pleaded, "Can you please tell my son to reduce eating sugar?" After giving some thought to the woman's request, Gandhi refused to do so and asked her to come after 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, the woman returned with her child to Gandhi's ashram. This time, Gandhi looked at the boy in his eyes and said, "Son, you should stop eating excessive sugar. It is bad for your health." The boy nodded and promised to do the same. The woman was curious as to why Gandhiji had taken 2 weeks to dictate such simple words. Gandhi replied that he needed that time to cut back from sugar himself, as he could not preach what he did not practice. So it is clear that if we can transform ourselves, we can transform the world. I'm sure you all would agree that we can change, can't we? We can certainly transform ourselves. It is not difficult if we put our minds and hearts into it. But I feel we are too sluggish. We leave it to the other. We want easy ways, shortcuts, undisturbed thoughts, and inward security. Desiring inward security, we seek it through outward things, through property, belief, money, temples, churches, mosques, etc. When you seek inward security, you create insecurity. By the very desire to be psychologically secure, you create destruction. Outward security is essential: food, clothing, and shelter. We want to be psychologically secure. So we use food, clothing, and shelter as a means of psychological security. We want transformation through legislation, through outward revolution, through systems, but yet we are inwardly untransformed. Inwardly, we are disturbed and confused. Without bringing order, peace, and happiness inwardly, we cannot have peace and happiness outwardly in the world. So if we transform ourselves, we can transform the world. If there is to be peace in this interconnected world, then it is our responsibility to be peaceful ourselves. We can be peaceful if we regularly meditate and reduce our expectations. But when two strong parties are each determined to have a position and power, naturally it is going to destroy man, who is caught in between. That is what is happening in this world and to your own family. When your wife or husband is possessive, when you cling to power in a small circle, you are contributing to world chaos. Without being peaceful ourselves, how can we expect the world to be peaceful? When belief in nationalism dominates you, when your country becomes of supreme importance, which is happening in every nation, then how will we ever have peace in this interconnected world? Let there be no war of ideologies, no vast issues, no huge expectations. Let there be a positive change in our relationship with others, and you will find peace knocking at your door, even in an interconnected world. I remember what I had learned during my American Field Service International Scholarship Days for a year in the US. And they always said that walk together, talk together, meet together, eat together, stay together, play together, then and only then shall ye have peace. I think in this convention, we have all walked together, we have all talked together, we have all eaten together, we have all been meeting each other. I think we have definitely contributed to peace in this world. While it may mean different things to different people, the most common definition of global citizenship is the idea that all people have responsibilities and have a desire to contribute to communities and the world at large in a positive way in order to improve the lives of others. So there are a number of challenges and responsibilities of global citizens. Let us look at some of them because they will tread the common ground on which responsible world citizens stand. The first is the responsibility to understand one's own perspective and the perspective of others on global issues. Next, the responsibility to respect cultural diversity. Next, the responsibility to build relationships with people from other countries and cultures, something that a convention like this does very well. The responsibility to understand the ways in which people and countries of the world are interconnected and interdependent. The responsibility to understand global issues. The responsibility to advocate for greater international cooperation with other nations. The responsibility for advocating for the implementation of the international agreements, conventions, and treaties related to global issues. And finally, the responsibility for advocating for more effective global equity and justice in each of the value domains of the world community. The idea of global citizenship has to be given a lot of importance in the interconnected world because globalization of trade, technology, research, art, and ideas have made societies better than we could have imagined only a few decades ago. For a large part of the world's population, the fact is that we have never been richer, more educated, or enlightened. And thanks to the World Wide Web, we are now more interconnected than ever before to the other people, their ideas, services, and products. But at the same time, global disparities in wealth, resources, and opportunities abound as the benefits of globalization are not distributed equally. The ones that have plenty get more, and those that have little gain little. Gender inequality is the norm in the world at large, with some exceptions. Our collaborative efforts as global citizens need to be aimed at giving women education and employment. Empowerment of women is the bottom line and their health care vital. As responsible world citizens, we all stand on a common ground and new ideas to bring equality and fairness must be tried. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed world citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Fortunately, more and more people now believe that true globalization is in everyone's interest, and joint efforts of humanity as a whole can benefit everyone. Madame Blavatsky writes in The Key to Theosophy, "It is only by all men becoming brothers and all women becoming sisters, and by all practicing in their daily lives true brotherhood and true sisterhood, that the real human solidarity can ever be achieved." Being a Rotarian myself, I remember that Rotary International had an annual theme 30 years back, "Look beyond yourself." If we all practice that, we can accomplish the first object of the Theosophical Society and build a world which is fraternity of equals standing on a common ground. If we develop the power to look beyond ourselves, then the individualized center of consciousness that we presently are will become the universal consciousness. This will be in everyone's interest. There is a charity song titled "We Are the World," originally recorded by the supergroup of USA musicians for Africa in 1985. It says, "We are the ones who make a brighter day, so let us start giving before someone has to say. There comes a time when we heed a certain call, when the world must come together as one and not fall." This song had a huge impact on the whole world when disasters occurred like the African famine in 1985 and the earthquake in Haiti during 2010. This song not only entertained millions, but it also provided exposure to third world poverty-stricken countries. This song has lyrics that empowered us to see the need to give to people less fortunate than ourselves. When people recognized the dire situation, they were much more generous with their donations. The theme of the song is based on the fact that everyone in the world is interconnected and part of the divine. Hence, the need for each of us to realize that regardless of our background, we all stand on the common ground. There is actual, objective, sane action when you perceive that you are a responsible world citizen, and when you realize it in your heart of hearts, in the depth of your being, that you are a divine spark, as the spiritual sage Raman Maharshi always said, that you are the rest of mankind, then realization will come that as responsible world citizens, we are all standing on the common ground. Then it will dawn on us, what is our responsibility in the interconnected world?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pradeep, for an excellent speech. Such important ideas in a relatively short speech. I keep as a motto, if we transform ourselves, we transform the world. Now we have Erika Georgiadis. Erika Georgiadis is the director of the School of Wisdom and also of the European School of Philosophy since 2017, and is the secretary of the International Theosophical History Conferences. In June 2022, she was elected Vice President of the Theosophical Society in Greece. She has been a member of the Theosophical Society ADR since 1991. From 1994 to 1996, she worked on a volunteer basis at the ADR archives. She is Master of Research in Religious Experience candidate at the University of Wales. She holds a PhD in Ancient Mediterranean Religions and a BA Honors in Philosophy and Psychological Studies. She lives with her husband and daughter in Greece. She has a deep interest in ecology, and she is animal rights activist. So really, Erika, please take the floor.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Greetings, heartfelt greetings to the attendees of the 147 International Convention of the Theosophical Society, to the honorable members of the General Council of the TS, to the International President, Tim Boyd, and his wife, Lily, who has been supporting and working by his side in this wonderful journey into keeping the work of the Theosophical Society together and moving forward. Also greetings to Maria Artman, who does so much for the Theosophical Society internationally and the ADR, and to the whole staff of ADR who has worked so hard to organize this international convention, and to Linda G, who is an inspiration to all of us. So it's truly an honor to be here with you today and have the opportunity to share with you a little of the history of the Brahmavidya ashram, which you may not be very much aware of it. Today, okay, so, yeah, I'm doing that. Yeah. So this is a quote from Radhaji, in which she says that the School of the Wisdom is one of the important activities of ADR. Important not only for this place, which is our campus, but for the work of the Theosophical Society as a whole, because it seeks to deepen the level of the participants' consciousness. Members of the society who remain at a superficial level with superficial interests cannot be effective in carrying out the society's objectives. Hence, the School of the Wisdom seeks to assist students to reach that depth. I think this statement is very important because it emphasizes the role and the importance of the School of the Wisdom. Now, how did the School of Wisdom started? How this work started? In order to give you an overview about that, we have to go back into the past and look at how the educational work of the Theosophical Society started in the 19th century. The work started with Colonel Olcott in 1894, when he founded the Olcott Memorial High School dedicated for underprivileged children. A number of schools during that period of time have been also founded across India and in Sri Lanka. There is no time to discuss that in detail here. The point is that early Theosophists considered education as a fundamental part of the work of the Theosophical movement. In 1913, the Theosophical Educational Trust was established with Annie Besant as president. And the trust had the goal to promote and manage the educational work of the Theosophical Society, which at the time was a quite large enterprise. In 1916, The Society for the Promotion of National Education was founded in India to support the development of schools based in Indian languages, religions and customs. Notice they have here created a Society for the Promotion of National Education to found schools which would teach in the local language or dialects of India, would teach the religious traditions and custom, and would emphasize the wonderful and the richness of the culture of India. The participants of the society, they were motivated by the desire to serve the Indian people and to prepare India for independence. Although the Theosophical Society for the Promotion of the National Education was not officially associated with the Theosophical Society, its staff and members, they were Theosophists, and all of them were heavily engaged in this educational project. Some of the Theosophists highly engaged in this work were Gina Rajadasa, Siri Run, Annie Besant, George Arundale, James H. Cousins, and others. Many of the workers of the Society for the Promotion of National Education, they were also members of the Order of the Brothers of Service. The Order of the Brothers of Service is actually the predecessor of the Theosophical Order of Service. We had also many eminent personalities linked to this work, as, for example, Mahatma Gandhi, Rabindranath Tagore, Sri Aurobindo, and many others. And the main idea was that to work, to offer the basis and create the foundation for a nationalistic education in India, valuing and emphasizing the customs, the traditions, and the languages. Annie Besant, at the time, she worked very intensively in trying to include Sanskrit languages as official, let's say, study part of the educational program in schools across India. At the time, unfortunately, she did not succeed in doing that. But recently, we had Professor Sadananda Das, who gave a wonderful class on Sanskrit, the divine language, at the School of the Wisdom Online. He's one of the greatest professors of the spoken language, spoken Sanskrit in the world, and he showed us how the movement to revive the Sanskrit language is so strong and powerful in India. We have no time to go into that also. However, one of the objects also of this National Society for the Promotion of Education was to train teachers by bringing the best educational professionals from all over the world. They were bringing the crème de la crème. That's why eventually Maria Montessori came to live in the campus. And in 2017 and 2018, they actually create summer classes campus here to train the teachers to do this work. Okay, so we have also, let me move my slides here. Did it change? Yes. That's that. Now, in 1970, Annie Besant, she was the president of the National Congress of India. And of course, within this climate of the importance of education within the Theosophical Society and the Theosophical movement at the time, Annie Besant suggested that the Indian Congress should vote for the foundation of the National University of India. The National Congress approved the foundation for the National University of India, and the chancellor was Rabindranath Tagore. Annie Besant, she was the president. Arundel was the recorder. And the National University of India started actually working at the Damodar Gardens. So at the Damodar Gardens, the first educational work that starts happening is with the National University of India. The National University of India was offering degrees in Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Science in Agriculture, and Bachelor of Teachers. However, the degrees were not officially recognized by the Indian government. And eventually, in 1922, Annie Besant lost, due to political conflicts and frictions, Annie Besant lost all the funding she had for the National University. And the National University had to be closed. Then, during a meeting of the Society for the Promotion of National Education, which James H. Couzens describes in a very interesting way, Annie Besant said, following up the closing of the National University, everyone was devastated about that. They had many professors, they had students for 40 years, they had an entire structure. But then they had this meeting, and Annie Besant said, open quote, "I wish we could have some kind of a school to follow up the university, to follow the university up," close quote. Krishnamurti was present, and as Annie Besant walked out of the meeting, Krishnamurti's eyes caught the eye of C.S. Trilokekar. You can see him there. He was also a staff member, a professor, a theosophist of the National University. Krishnaji's eyes look at him and look at Couzens. Their eyes gravitated to each other. And then Krishnaji said, "You heard what Annie Besant said. That was not casual. We must follow it up." So, after that, James H. Couzens, C.S. Trilokekar, Jiddu Krishnamurti, Jinaraj Dasa, Arundel, the entire staff of the National University that had been closed, started working together on a project to create a school. Okay, let me go back. And eventually, actually very soon, they present the proposal for the creation of a school using the premises of the Damodar Garden, which was the premises of the National University, and the staff of the National University. And they had a meeting with Krishnamurti, Nityananda, Jinaraj Dasa, the staff of the university, everyone, and they draft a formation plan to present for Annie Besant. They proposed 3 names, basically 4 names, for what they were very often calling the University of the Future. You know, I love this because they were visionaries and they were thinking in such a holistic way that it's truly wonderful when we look back to the work they were doing. So the first name they proposed was the Brahmavidya Ashram. The second was the Adyar Institute. The third was the Theosophical College of Universal Learning. And then the Adyar School of Synthetic Studies. Of course, you all know how close to Besant's heart was Sanatana Dharma. And the name chosen was then the Brahmavidya Ashram. And that's the very beginning of the birth of the School of the Wisdom as we know today. So the Brahmavidya Ashram was founded on the 2nd of October of 1922 and was officially inaugurated at the Damodar Gardens in the open-air college hall under the great trees. The inauguration started with the recitation of prayers, of universal prayers, from the great religions. This was followed by a poem read by Rabindranath Tagore from his work, the Gintali No. 4, that offers one's life for the highest purpose. The poem, of course, originally written in Bengali, but I cannot read Bengali, forgive me, and I'm reading the translation. The poem, among other things, says, open quote, "Life of my life, I shall ever try to keep my body pure, knowing that thy living touch is upon all my limbs. I shall ever try to keep all untruths out from my thoughts, knowing that thou art that truth which has kindled the light of reason in my mind." And the poem goes on. Yeah, okay. So, during the opening, after Rabindranath Tagore read this poem, there was an hymn of praise to the Creator for the gifts of the earth and sustenance and beauty for knowledge and pleasure. The students were then introduced, and at the time they had around 120 students, one by one to Annie Besant, who greeted and welcomed personally each one of them. Then she delivered the first lecture of the ashram focusing on mysticism. The opening lecture that focused on mysticism basically was a search for reality. The notion of reality at the time, it was very interesting for them because they had a very Platonic idea that this world is a shadow, simply a shadow or reflects a reflection of the divine reality, which is currently beyond our understanding. And she discussed about the mystic way and pointed out the similarity of mystical experiences in all times and places. The following days, the school was opened by her with lectures on philosophy, art, organizations, and religion. Annie Besant had a very interesting vision of education. In the 19th century, Vedanta was not taught at schools, while Christian schools, or the missionary schools, they were teaching the Christian religion. So she actually wrote that it was unacceptable that a foreign religion is taught at the school classes while the one from India are not? She said, open quote, the boy has to choose between no religious teaching at all and the teaching of the religion which is different from his own. That is the worst defect of the education in India, and see how dangerous it becomes. Close quote. One work that was very important for theosophists here in India was to revive and to value the different traditions and different religions. For example, when Blavatsky and Olcott came to India, Buddhism was almost non-existent anymore as a religion in this country, and they engaged into the process of reviving religion. And they were actually very proud because they organized the first inter-religious dialogue that happened in the 19th century. We know that in older times this has happened also, but like 500 years ago. And that for the first time, they managed to put together in a brotherly way, in a spirit of confraternization, Muslims, Buddhists, Sikhs, Christians, Hindus. Now, the first principal of the Brahmavidya Ashram was James H. Cousins. Yeah, leave it there. Thank you. Leave it there. Thank you. So the first principal of the school was James H. Cousins, who planned, as a part of the ashram cultural work, to create an art collection for the museum in Adyar. Art was part of their curriculum. They had a very large and holistic curriculum in which they included geography, which is, let's say, geography mixed with theosophy, and they included astronomy, they included astrology, they included art, painting, crafts, and so on and so forth. So the first principal planned to create an art collection for a museum in Adyar. And for the ashram art collection, a watercolor painting by Chandra Shekhara was the first painting donated to the collection. And this was donated in 1922. There are two paintings by the same painter, Baby, P.K. Chatterjee is the name of the painting, and then you can see it. This is at the museum. It's not exhibited today, but it's a wonderful artwork, and this was the first painting gifted to the art collection of the Brahmavidya Ashram. And James Cousins says, open quote, works such as these have not only a high spiritual value, but are also necessary adjuncts to the study department of the ashram. There is a growing demand on many members that our lectures and work must involve art. But not only Indian or Eastern, but a holistic approach to art. So the first work of the ashram, the first activity, was actually a meeting, and it was a very intensive program in which they presented 100 lectures during 1 week. And the ashram worked and functioned very well, and it was very successful. It was, they had a program that it was 1 year and divided into 2 semesters. But eventually, in 1929, the ashram stopped working. And this is the year that the Order of the Eastern Star was dissolved by Krishnaji. And then we understand that there is a process of change, a process, of course, of reevaluation of the ideas and the work of the DES. And of course, this affected the work of the ashram that stopped functioning. Annie Besant also was very aged at the time. She passed away 40 years after that. And then there is an interruption in the work of the Brahmavidyana Ashram from 1929 until 1949, when finally Jinaraj Dasa revives it again. Jinaraj Dasa was one of its founders in 1949, and the ashram starts working in the model we know, in the format we know today. They were initially organizing 3-month program, 3-month classes, which I have participated here, for example, in 94, 95, 96. And the program has been structured in the classical way you know today. So one could ask, wow, if the Brahmavidya Ashram was not functioning for 20 years, can we really celebrate 100 years for the existence of the ashram? I gave an example that Pedro did not like much, but I'm going to use it here, which is in philosophy, we use thought experiments that help us intuitively to answer some difficult questions or challenging ones. So imagine you have someone in coma, all right? The person enters in coma in 1929, and the person wakes up from coma in 1949. Of course, I'm not saying that the Brahmavidya Ashram was in coma, but this is just a rhetorical example. When that person, and that person eventually closed 100 years old, so are we going to remove those 20 years of inactivity from the life of the person? No. No. And do you know that works also for the lodges? There are many lodges that they may become inactive for some years, but if the founders or one of the founders is still somehow connected to the lodge can be revived, reawakened, so it is valid, our celebration of the 100 years of anniversary of the Brahmavidya Ashram. Having said that, I'm going to close now this presentation. One of the most beautiful and inspiring work that was emphasized during the time of the Brahmavidya Ashram was the importance to dream. To dream together was the importance of imagination. How many times have you sit together with each other to dream together, to share your dreams without limits, without fears, without worries, oh, we don't have money to do that. Oh, this is going to be difficult to do that. It doesn't matter. Because in dreaming, we are envisioning a work that could be done, that could happen. And actually, a very successful man, which was Ulysses Riddle, the father of Marco and Isis, a great theosophist, and one of the greatest lawyers of Brazil, he once told me, we should not be afraid of dreaming. We should dream without limits and try to reach that, our dream. Because if we cannot materialize in its entirety what we are dreaming, for example, I would very much like to buy a Greek island for the Theosophical Society in Greece. But I don't think that, so you have to dream big. And Ulysses said, if you cannot reach that, you get close to that. And this was a work something very much emphasized in the Brahmavidya Ashram, the importance to dream. And also one of the richest men of the world, Elon Musk, he's not very popular now because of the Twitter situation, but he said that when he was a child. He was dreaming so much. He had so many ideas, and that he was so surprised when he was meeting other people and understanding they were not dreaming or having ideas in the way that, like, he thought it was a normal way of being. And that schools and the educational system doesn't allow that to happen. They put us within boxes. You have to learn this and that and the other. They don't say, please, go sit with your friends and dream on how you could build a better world or what you could do to inspire people around us. But they were doing this in the Brahma Vidya ashram. And with this, in this note, I want to close with a poem that I hope I will not cry. Yesterday I called a friend of mine, Juliet. I told her, look, Juliet, I want to read this poem during the convention. And I was reading, I read it 4 times and I cried for the 4 times. I said, I have to be very strong to read it and not to cry, because it, at least for me, inspires very much. I think that we theosophists are all a Don Quixote. Like Don Quixote, we are dreamers, you know? And then the work of the Brahma Vidya Ashram and the work of the School of the Wisdom today, as we are moving forward, is also to incentive that, to remind you that, to give you space to dream together, you know? So I'm going to read you the poem, To Dream the Impossible Dream, to fight the unbearable foe, to bear with unbearable sorrow, to run where the brave dare not to go, to right the unrightable wrong, to love pure and chaste from afar, to try when your arms are too weary, to reach the unreachable star. This is our quest, to follow that star, no matter how hopeless, no matter how far, to fight for the right without question or pause, to be willing to march into hell for a heavenly cause. And we know, if we only be true to this glorious quest, that our hearts will lie peaceful and calm when we are laid to rest. And the world will be better for this, that, I want to cry, that we, strong and covered with scars, still strove with our last ounce of courage to fight the unbeatable foe and to reach the unreachable star. So as a theosophist, I wish also for all of you in this new year that you try to reach that unreachable star. And let's dream together. Please, if you have ideas for possible work that we could implement in the School of the Wisdom, do talk to me. I will be here. I would like to hear your ideas and to meet each one of you and dream together and try to reach to that unreachable star together. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Erica. I think you changed the vibration in here. Well, I think she has presented the history of the School of the Wisdom completely in a comprehensive way. in just, I would say, short speech. Well, I think we come to the end of this session, this morning session. I don't know if Brother Sikar has got some announcements. From myself, big thank you.